The traveling circus arrived in the quiet town like a breath of fresh air, breaking the monotony of peaceful days. The usually silent streets were now filled with whispers and excited laughter. Large, colorful wagons carrying tents and equipment passed through the town center, drawing curious glances. Among the performers was Peter, a young and charming clown whose enigmatic smile hid more than one could imagine. He was a crowd favorite, capable of eliciting laughter even from the most serious spectators. Peter, despite his youth, was a complete artist. During the show, he stood out not only for his skill with jokes but also for the delicate way he interacted with the audience. His presence was captivating, and he quickly became one of the circus's stars. His performance was a blend of comedy and mystery, always leaving a sense that there was more behind the painted smile. During one of the performances, the circus was more crowded than ever. The atmosphere was electrifying, and the audience was eager to see Peter's antics. Amidst laughter and applause, he decided to focus on an elderly woman in the crowd. With a mischievous smile, Peter approached her, asking her to come up on stage for a little fun. "Come, my lady. I promise you won't regret it," Peter said, extending his hand. The woman, a bit hesitant but encouraged by the clown's contagious energy, accepted the invitation and stepped onto the stage. "Your name?" he asked with an exaggerated bow. "Margaret," she replied, smiling shyly. Peter gently held her hand, preparing for the magic trick. As he chatted with the audience, Margaret noticed a peculiar mark on his hand. The scar, which she immediately recognized, brought a flood of painful memories rushing back. With a contained expression of surprise, Margaret asked, "That mark? How did you get it?" Peter, without missing a beat, smiled and casually replied, "Ah, it's an old story. Let's just say I'm a survivor of a life full of adventures." He winked at the audience, drawing laughter and applause. But for Margaret, the scar was much more than a curiosity. After the performance, Margaret remained unsettled, struggling to maintain her composure. As she stepped down from the stage, she couldn't shake the image of the scar from her mind. "Could you tell me more about your story?" she asked, her voice trying not to betray her anxiety. Peter shrugged, still keeping his relaxed tone. "I'm a clown, my lady. Every scar tells a joke or a sad story, depending on how you look at it." He laughed, but Margaret felt the weight of his words, knowing there was more behind that painted smile. That night, Margaret barely slept. Peter's words echoed in her mind, and the image of the scar was inescapable. The day after the performance, Margaret could barely contain her anxiety. Determined to uncover the truth about Peter, she sought out Detective Mr. Collins. They sat in a small cafe in the town center, a discreet place where they could talk without interruptions. Margaret began to describe in detail the scar she had seen on Peter's hand. "It was exactly as I remembered. The same shape, the same spot," she said, her voice laden with emotion. Mr. Collins, always meticulous, took notes in his notebook. "And are you sure this mark is unique? It could be that other people have something similar." Margaret shook her head, resolute. "I'm sure, Mr. Collins. It's the same mark my son had. I can't explain it, but I feel like it's him." The detective nodded, recognizing the determination in her eyes. To begin the investigation, Mr. Collins decided to follow the circus and gather information about the performers. He disguised himself as a spectator and mingled with the crowd during the shows, observing every detail. One evening, he managed to get close to Peter backstage. Pretending to be interested in the circus, he initiated a casual conversation. "Great show today. You're really talented, Peter. How did you start in the circus life?" Peter, always relaxed, smiled and replied, "Oh, thank you. It happened by chance, really. The circus life found me, and I just went along with it." Mr. Collins noticed that the young man was evasive about his past, a common trait among those with something to hide. "And your family? Are they also performers?" Peter hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't have a family, just the circus. They are all I have." The detective mentally noted the response, aware that there might be more behind that simple statement. Meanwhile, Margaret anxiously awaited news from the detective. When they met again, Mr. Collins brought some preliminary information. Peter doesn't seem to have any records before joining the circus. It's as if he didn't exist before that, he explained while flipping through his notes. Margaret frowned, puzzled. That's strange. It's like someone erased his past. The detective agreed. Exactly. We're going to need to dig deeper. In the following days, Mr. Collins continued his investigation, speaking with other members of the circus and trying to learn more about Peter. He discovered that the young man had been found by the circus owner under mysterious circumstances, with no memory of his past. He just showed up one day, disoriented, and the circus owner took him in. One of the performers told him, since then, he's been part of the circus family. This information filled Margaret with a mix of hope and fear. Could Peter really be her long-lost son? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Margaret and the detective knew they were getting closer to the truth. But many questions remained unanswered. Who was the circus owner? And why didn't Peter remember anything about his previous life? With each new discovery, the mystery deepened. Margaret felt the weight of memories and renewed hopes, anxious to finally know if the young clown was indeed the son she had lost. After days of intense investigation, Mr. Collins finally gathered enough information to confirm his suspicions. He scheduled a meeting with Margaret in his office, where he would reveal his findings. The atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. When Margaret arrived, the detective greeted her with a grave expression. Margaret, I've discovered something very important about Peter, he began, opening an envelope filled with documents. Margaret held her breath as the detective continued. Peter is, in fact, your missing son. His real name is Michael, and he was taken many years ago. The mark on his hand confirms this. It's the same birthmark you described. Margaret felt a wave of emotions. Relief, joy, and a deep sadness for all the lost time. She placed her hand on her chest, trying to control her breathing. I knew. I always knew, she murmured, tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Collins went on to explain the details. Apparently, Peter was found by the circus owner under mysterious circumstances, with no memory of who he was. It seems he suffered some kind of trauma that blocked his memories. Margaret listened intently, absorbing every word. So, he doesn't know who I am, or who he is, she said, her voice trembling. The detective nodded. That's correct. But now we have the chance to tell him the truth. Determined to reunite with her son, Margaret decided to visit the circus once more. She and Mr. Collins carefully planned the approach. We'll wait until the end of the performance and talk to him backstage, the detective suggested. Margaret agreed, still nervous about confronting Peter with the truth. I hope he can accept me after everything, she said with a distant look. Mr. Collins reassured her. He is your son, Margaret. The bond of blood is strong. We'll figure out how to handle this together. On the day of the reunion, Margaret was visibly anxious. The circus was packed with spectators, but she barely noticed the commotion around her. After the show ended, she and the detective discreetly made their way backstage. There, they found Peter, who was removing his makeup. When he saw them, he frowned, confused. You again? What's going on? He asked, intrigued. Margaret stepped forward, her heart racing. Peter, or rather Michael. I am your mother, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Peter looked at her, incredulous. What? Is this some kind of joke? He asked, looking at the detective for explanations. Mr. Collins maintained a serious expression. No, Peter, this is real. You are Michael, the son Margaret lost many years ago. Peter remained silent, absorbing the information. The revelation was a shock for Peter. He looked at Margaret, trying to find some hidden memory in his mind. I don't know what to say, he murmured, confused. Margaret approached him, her eyes filled with tears. I searched for you for so long. I thought I'd never find you. Peter felt a whirlwind of emotions, unsure of how to react. He had spent his entire life without any memory of his family, and now everything was changing. The revelation also caught the attention of the circus owner, who was watching the scene from a distance. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern. He knew more than he was letting on, and the presence of Margaret and the detective spelled trouble. The atmosphere backstage grew tense, and everyone present could feel the gravity of the moment. The truth was finally coming to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret and Detective Mr. Collins waited patiently backstage as Peter tried to process the shocking revelation about his true identity. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and everyone was waiting for the young man's reaction. Peter, still confused and incredulous, looked directly at Margaret. "So, you're saying I'm your son? That I was kidnapped?" He shook his head, struggling to comprehend. It's too much to believe." Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling but full of determination. "Yes, Michael, you are my son. You were taken from me when you were just a child. That mark on your hand, it's the same one you had when you were born." She extended her hand, showing an old photo she carried with her. Peter took the photo, examining it with wide eyes. The similarities were undeniable, and a part of him began to believe. "But how did this happen?" he asked, still trying to make sense of it all. Before Margaret could answer, the circus owner, Mr. Morrison, appeared, interrupting the conversation. "What's going on here? Who are these people?" he asked with a sharp tone, looking directly at Mr. Collins. The detective remained composed. "We're here to talk to Peter about his past," he replied, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Morrison frowned, visibly uncomfortable. "Peter's past is none of your business. He belongs to the circus now." The tension escalated as Mr. Morrison tried to push Margaret and the detective away, positioning himself between them and Peter. "You need to leave. Now!" he commanded, his voice cold and authoritarian. Margaret stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere until I speak to my son," she said firmly. Peter, seeing the situation escalating, tried to intervene. "Wait, everyone. Can we calm down?" he pleaded, trying to keep the peace. But the circus owner was not willing to back down. Realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, Mr. Morrison grabbed Margaret's arm, trying to force her out. "You don't belong here. Peter is with me now, and you'd better accept that," he threatened. At that moment, Mr. Collins sprang into action, grabbing the circus owner's arm and pushing him away from Margaret. "Don't touch her," the detective ordered, his voice firm. The situation quickly escalated into a physical confrontation. Peter, shocked, watched the chaos unfold, unsure of how to react. He was torn between the man he considered a father figure and the woman who claimed to be his mother. "Stop! Everyone, stop!" he shouted, trying to be heard above the turmoil. However, the fight continued, and in the heat of the moment, Mr. Morrison's shirt tore, revealing a tattoo on his chest. Margaret, watching in horror, immediately recognized the symbol. "That tattoo," she murmured, her eyes wide with shock. The revelation of the tattoo sent a fresh wave of shock through Margaret. She vividly remembered the man who had kidnapped her son, and that tattoo was a detail she had never forgotten. You're the man who took him," she accused, pointing at Mr. Morrison. The circus owner, now visibly nervous, tried to cover the tattoo and back away. "You're crazy," he retorted, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. Peter looked from Margaret to the circus owner, confusion and anger mixing on his face. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice filled with pain. Mr. Morrison, realizing he was cornered, tried to defend himself. "Don't believe her, Peter. They're trying to tear you away from the circus, from your family." But the evidence was all there, and the truth was finally coming to light. The confrontation at the circus became the decisive moment when the past and present collided in an irreversible way. The air backstage was thick with tension and emotions running high. After the revelation of the tattoo on Mr. Morrison's chest, the atmosphere grew even more hostile. Margaret, determined not to let the man who had ruined her life escape, stepped closer to him, her eyes blazing with anger. "You're responsible for all of this, for all the suffering we've been through," she accused, her voice trembling with emotion. Peter, still processing the revelation, stared intently at the circus owner, waiting for an answer. Mr. Morrison, realizing there was no longer any way to deny the accusations, tried to maintain his composure. "Listen, you don't know the whole story," he said, trying to buy time. "I had no choice. What I did out of necessity." Margaret, incredulous, interrupted. "No choice? You destroyed our lives. You took my son from me?" she exclaimed, tears welling up in her eyes. Peter, feeling his mother's pain, stepped forward, facing the man he had considered a mentor. The circus owner, now cornered, tried to evade the accusations. "I took care of you, Peter. I gave you a life, a family. Without me, you would have had nothing," he said, attempting to manipulate the young man. But Peter was torn. "You lied to me all these years?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Everything I knew about myself was a lie?" Mr. Collins, recognizing the manipulation, stepped in. "You have no right to speak of family," he said firmly. The tension culminated in a physical confrontation when Mr. Morrison, desperate, tried to attack the detective. With a sudden move, he shoved Mr. Collins, attempting to take him out of the equation. "You don't know anything. Stay out of this," he shouted, losing control. But Mr. Collins was prepared. With skill, he dodged the attack and immobilized the circus owner, holding him by the arms. "It's over for you. There's nowhere left to run," the detective said, looking directly into Mr. Morrison's eyes. Peter, witnessing the violence unfolding before him, tried to intervene. "Stop! This isn't going to solve anything," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Margaret, heartbroken, watched everything, feeling helpless. "Michael, stay behind me," she urged, concerned for her son's safety. But Peter didn't want to stay on the sidelines any longer. He needed answers, needed to understand what was happening. The fight quickly escalated, and in the midst of the turmoil, Mr. Morrison managed to break free. He turned to Peter, desperate to justify himself. "I did what needed to be done. I protected you," he tried to explain, but his words fell on deaf ears. Peter, finally seeing the man who raised him for who he truly was, shook his head sadly. "You used me, and you used everyone around you," he said with a cold calmness. As the situation unfolded, other members of the circus began to gather, drawn by the noise and commotion. All eyes were on the dramatic scene playing out. The truth was finally being revealed, and the impact was devastating. Mr. Collins, regaining control, called for one of the members to fetch a rope. "We need to restrain him until the police arrive," he ordered, knowing they couldn't let Mr. Morrison escape again. With Mr. Morrison finally subdued, the backstage of the circus fell into a tense silence. The truth, heavy and cruel, was laid bare for all to see. Peter, still processing everything, looked at his mother and then at the detective. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. Margaret, holding her son's hand, answered softly, "Now we try to find a way to move forward. Together." Margaret pointed to the tattoo, her voice low but laden with intensity. "That tattoo. I will never forget it. It was you. You took my son from me." Her words cut through the silence like a blade. Mr. Morrison, realizing there was no longer any way to deny the truth, lowered his head. "Yes, it was me," he finally admitted, his voice hoarse and defeated. "But you don't understand. There were reasons for everything that happened." Peter, hearing the confession, felt a mix of anger and confusion. Reasons? What kind of reasons could justify ripping a child away from his family? He asked, his voice filled with pain. The circus owner looked at him, his expression a blend of regret and self-justification. "My wife. She couldn't have children. When you came along, it was like an opportunity had presented itself. We loved you as if you were our own," he explained, trying to soften the impact of his actions. Margaret shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Do you think that justifies everything? You destroyed our lives," she exclaimed, her voice breaking with emotion. Mr. Collins, standing beside her, nodded in support. "There's no justification for what you did. The law will take care of you now," he said, with a firmness that left no room for argument. Meanwhile, other members of the circus began to murmur among themselves. The shocking revelation about Mr. Morrison's past had left everyone stunned. Many of them had been completely unaware of their boss's dark history. One of the performers, a young trapeze artist named Clara, approached, her expression a mix of confusion and sorrow. "We never knew. He was always like a father to us," she said, looking at Peter with sympathy. Peter, still trying to process everything, felt lost. "And now, what do I do?" he asked, almost to himself. Margaret gripped his hand tightly. "You come with me. We'll try to rebuild our life together," she said, her voice full of hope and promise. Peter looked at his mother, feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The idea of leaving the circus, the only life he had ever known, was frightening, but the prospect of a new life with his biological mother offered a hope he had never imagined. Mr. Morrison, now in the custody of Mr. Collins and other circus members, remained silent. His attempts to justify his actions had failed, and he knew he would face the consequences of his crimes. As he was being led away, he looked at Peter one last time. "Remember, we really did love you, even though all of this was wrong," he said, his voice a mix of sadness and despair. Mr. Collins quickly grabbed his phone and called the police, informing them of the situation. "We have the person responsible for a kidnapping in our custody. We're at the traveling circus, and we need a patrol car here as soon as possible," the detective explained, keeping his composure as he recounted the recent events. As they waited for the police to arrive, the circus performers and staff began to gather, murmuring among themselves. Some were in shock, others in denial, unable to accept that the man they considered a leader and protector was, in fact, a criminal. Clara, the young trapeze artist, looked at Peter, her eyes filled with confusion. "And now, what will happen to the circus?" she asked, her voice trembling. Peter, still reeling from the revelations, just shook his head. "I don't know, Clara. I don't think anyone knows," he replied, trying to process everything. A few minutes later, the sound of police sirens pierced the night. 2 patrol cars arrived at the scene, and the officers quickly got out, ready to take action. The team leader, a sergeant with a serious expression, approached Mr. Collins. "We received your call. Where is the suspect?" he asked, looking around. Mr. Collins pointed to Mr. Morrison, who was sitting on the ground, under the watchful eyes of some circus members. "There he is. He confessed to kidnapping a child years ago," the detective explained, his voice steady. The officers approached Mr. Morrison, efficiently handcuffing him. "You are under arrest for the kidnapping of a child and other possible charges," the sergeant declared as he read him his rights. Mr. Morrison, with his head lowered, didn't resist. He knew his time was up. As he was being led to the patrol car, he cast one last look at Peter, but the young man avoided eye contact, still struggling to grasp everything that was happening. Margaret watched closely, holding Peter's hand tightly. She felt a mix of relief and sadness. The man who had destroyed her family would finally face justice, but the emotional toll of it all was immense. When the sergeant approached her and the detective, he thanked them for their cooperation. "We'll take him to the station for questioning. You both will need to give statements," he informed them, his tone formal. Peter, still in shock, turned to Margaret. "And now, what happens to him?" he asked, referring to Mr. Morrison. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "He'll face justice, son. He'll pay for what he did," she replied, her voice soft but determined. Peter nodded, though the words didn't bring the comfort he had hoped for. The arrival of the police marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, filled with uncertainties and challenges. The other members of the circus, still stunned by the turn of events, began to disperse. The show was over, and harsh reality had taken its place. Clara and some of the other performers approached Peter, offering words of support. "No matter what happens, we'll always be your family too," she said, with a sad smile. Peter thanked them, feeling a tightness in his chest. He knew he was about to leave behind everything he had ever known. As the police took Mr. Morrison away and began investigating the scene, Margaret and Peter prepared to leave. There were still many questions to be answered and many wounds to heal. But for now, the most important thing was that they were together. With one last look at the circus, Peter and Margaret got into Mr. Collins' car, ready to face the future that awaited them. After the tumultuous series of events at the circus, Margaret brought Peter to her home, a luxurious mansion far removed from the simple, itinerant world he had known. The imposing mansion, with its elegant columns and well-manicured gardens, was a symbol of the wealth and comfort she had accumulated over the years. As they entered, Peter immediately felt out of place, as if he had stepped into a completely foreign world. Sensing her son's discomfort, Margaret tried to ease the situation. "This is where you belong now, Michael, or Peter if you prefer," she said with a gentle smile. Peter looked around, taking in the grandeur of the place. "It's different from the circus," he replied hesitantly. He walked through the entry hall, observing the walls adorned with artwork and the sophisticated furniture. Everything seemed so distant from his previous reality. Margaret, determined to make him feel at home, began showing him around the house. "This is the living room, where we can relax, and over there is the kitchen. I can have something special prepared for you," she suggested, trying to create a welcoming atmosphere. Despite Margaret's efforts to make him feel at home, Peter felt like a fish out of water. The fine clothes his mother bought for him, the gourmet meals, and the formal table manners were all completely new to him. He spent his days exploring the house, but the grandeur and luxury only intensified his sense of isolation. Sometimes, he found himself staring out the window, thinking about the simple life at the circus, where each day was a new adventure and everyone felt like one big family. Margaret, on the other hand, was determined to make up for lost time with her son. She organized special dinners, invited friends from high society, and tried to integrate him into her social life. "These are the people you can count on, Michael," she explained as she introduced him to friends and family. However, Peter felt uncomfortable with the attention and formality. "Thank you, Mom, but I think I need some time to adjust," he would say, trying to be polite. Things began to get complicated when other members of Margaret's family started to take notice. Distant relatives, who had previously shown little interest in her life, were now concerned about Peter's return. He was now the legitimate heir to Margaret's fortune, and this sparked jealousy and distrust. During a family gathering, a distant cousin of Margaret's, Robert, made a veiled comment. "So, the lost heir has returned. I hope he lives up to expectations," he said with a fake smile. Peter sensed the hostility in his words and responded coolly, "I'm not here for the money, Robert. I just want to get to know my mother." Margaret, sensing the tension, tried to mediate the situation. "We all need time to adjust to this new reality. Michael is part of the family, and he will always be welcome here," she stated firmly. However, her words did little to ease the discomfort Peter felt. He began to wonder if he would ever be able to fit into this new world. The memories of the circus, with its colorful lights and genuine laughter, seemed like a distant refuge compared to the cold formality of his new life. As the days passed, Peter struggled to find his place. He distanced himself from social events, preferring to spend time alone, exploring the house or walking through the gardens. Margaret watched all this with a mix of concern and sadness. She knew the adjustment would be difficult, but she hadn't imagined it would be so painful for both of them. "I just want you to be happy, Michael," she said one night as they dined together. Peter looked at her with a sad smile. "I do too, Mom. I do too." Peter's life in Margaret's house quickly became even more complicated with the growing hostility from the relatives. The arrival of the lost heir had sparked not only curiosity but also envy and resentment among the family members. Now living in a luxurious mansion, Peter constantly felt judged by those who expected him to behave according to the standards of a legitimate heir. During a family dinner, the atmosphere was visibly tense. Peter sat beside his mother, trying to fit into the sophisticated world around him. As the refined dishes were served, whispered conversations and furtive glances were exchanged among the relatives. His distant cousin, Evelyn, an elegant woman with a critical gaze, was the first to break the silence. "So, Peter, how are you adapting to our little family?" she asked, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sensing the provocation, Peter responded calmly. "Still getting used to it, I'd say. It's all very new to me." Evelyn let out a dry laugh. "I imagine it is. Things must be quite different from where you come from," she commented, insinuating the contrast between his life in the circus and the family's wealth. Margaret, catching the insinuation, stepped in. "We're all adjusting. The important thing is that we're together now," she said, trying to ease the tension. However, Evelyn's subtle comments were just the beginning. Other relatives began to express their opinions in equally biting but indirect ways. Robert, the distant cousin who had already shown distrust, didn't miss the chance to make a sarcastic remark. "I hope you're ready to take on your responsibilities, Peter. Being part of this family isn't just about inheritance," he said, looking directly at Peter. Peter felt the weight of the words and the implicit pressure. "I'm willing to learn and integrate, but I'm not here to fulfill expectations that aren't mine," he replied, trying to maintain his dignity. Peter's direct response surprised everyone, but also intensified the atmosphere of hostility. Evelyn gave a haughty smile. "Well, we'll see if time brings the necessary wisdom," she said, ending the conversation with a tone of superiority. Margaret, visibly uncomfortable, tried to change the subject, but Peter's discomfort was evident. He felt that no matter what he did, he would never be fully accepted by this family. The following weeks were no different. Every family gathering was an opportunity for passive-aggressive comments and disapproving looks. The feeling of being an outsider in his own home grew stronger. One evening, Peter confided in his mother. "I feel like I'll never be accepted here, Mom. No matter what I do, they'll always see me as an intruder," he confessed, his voice heavy with frustration. Margaret, her heart aching, tried to console him. "I know it's hard, Michael, but you are my son, and that will never change. Give them time, and give yourself time," she said, trying to keep hope alive. Peter tried to follow his mother's advice, but the family's rejection was like a constant shadow. He distanced himself more and more from social events, preferring the company of the few household staff who treated him kindly. He spent hours in the garden, finding peace among the plants and flowers, far from the judgmental eyes of the relatives. Margaret, on the other hand, felt powerless, torn between her love for her son and the need to keep peace within the family. The rejection and disdain began to erode Peter's confidence, leaving him increasingly isolated and insecure. He knew he was entitled to the inheritance, but the weight of it seemed increasingly unbearable. Deep down, Peter longed for one thing: to find his own place in the world, where he could be accepted for who he truly was, free from the shackles of the past or the suffocating expectations of an imposed future. As time passed, the investigations into Mr. Morrison and his dark past began to reveal disturbing details. Mr. Collins, the relentless detective, delved deep into records and testimonies, determined to uncover every hidden secret. What he discovered left everyone shocked. Mr. Morrison was not just an eccentric circus owner, but also had a dangerous criminal history. During a meeting with Margaret and Peter, Mr. Collins shared his findings. It appears that Mr. Morrison was involved in a child trafficking ring. He began with a grave expression. Margaret's eyes widened as she brought her hand to her mouth in horror. "My God! So it's true?" she murmured. Peter, feeling a wave of nausea, asked in a trembling voice, "And was I one of the victims?" The detective nodded, confirming his suspicions. Mr. Collins continued, explaining the sordid details. He would abduct children from various parts of the country, selling them to wealthy families or for illegal labor. However, it seems you, Peter, were the only one he kept. His wife apparently developed an attachment to you and decided to raise you as her own. Peter remained silent, absorbing the information. The idea that his entire life had been a lie was devastating. Margaret, struggling to keep her composure, squeezed Peter's hand. You were saved from a terrible fate, son. We're together now, and that's what matters, she said, trying to comfort him. The news quickly spread throughout the town, causing an uproar among the residents and circus performers. Many of the circus members, who had been unaware of Mr. Morrison's illegal activities, were shocked and devastated. Clara, the young trapeze artist who had become friends with Peter, was among those most affected. I never imagined he could do something so horrible, she confessed to Peter, tears in her eyes. He always treated us well, like family. Peter, sharing Clara's pain, tried to console her. He deceived all of us, Clara, but now the truth is out. The revelation of Mr. Morrison's past also brought to light other survivors' stories. Some of the children who had been kidnapped managed to escape or were rescued, and their testimonies began to surface in the media. Peter read each of the stories with a mix of sadness and relief. He knew he had been lucky to escape that fate, but he also felt deep sorrow for all those who had suffered at the hands of the man he once considered a father. Margaret, determined to help Peter overcome the trauma, began seeking out specialized therapists to help him deal with the revelations. We don't have to face this alone, Michael, she said firmly. We'll find someone who can help you process all of this. Peter, though initially reluctant, agreed. He knew he needed help to understand and overcome the horrors of his past. Meanwhile, the circus was shut down by the authorities, and a full investigation was launched. Mr. Morrison, already in custody, faced a series of charges that would ensure his conviction. The circus performers, devastated by the loss of their home and the betrayal of their leader, were being assisted by support organizations. Peter, feeling torn between his love for the circus and the need to move forward, offered his help to his former colleagues. You will always be my family too. We'll get through this together, he promised, his heart heavy. The discovery of Mr. Morrison's criminal past was a turning point for everyone involved. For Peter, it marked the beginning of a new journey, one in which he had to discover who he truly was, beyond what had been imposed on him. For Margaret, it was the realization that, despite all the horrors, she finally had her son back. And for the circus members, it was the painful end of an era, but also the opportunity to start anew, free from the shadows of a dark past. As time went on, Peter and Margaret began to rebuild the relationship that had been stolen from them. The pain of the revelations and past experiences was palpable, but both were determined to find a path to healing. The therapy sessions that Peter started attending helped him process the conflicting emotions and the trauma of discovering that his entire life had been a lie. Margaret, for her part, was by Peter's side every step of the way. She dedicated herself to creating a safe and loving environment for him, something he had never had the chance to experience. Gradually, the emotional wounds began to heal, and Peter started to open up more, sharing his memories of the circus and the few happy moments he had. The circus was my home in a way, but now, I want to create new memories with you, Mom, he said with a shy smile. The acceptance of Peter by some of Margaret's family members also began to change. Those who initially rejected him as an intruder started to realize how much he was a victim of circumstances. Robert, who had been one of the most critical, apologized to Peter. I was wrong to judge you so quickly. You've been through much more than any of us could imagine, he admitted, extending his hand. Peter, surprised, accepted Robert's hand. I understand. We're all trying to deal with this in our own way, he replied with maturity. With time, Peter began to find his own path. He decided to pursue an education, something he never had the opportunity to do while living in the circus. Margaret was moved by his decision to enroll in art and literature courses. You have a natural talent for creativity. I always knew there was something special about you, she said proudly. Feeling more confident, Peter began to explore new possibilities, including the idea of helping other victims of abduction and abuse, inspired by his own journey of overcoming adversity. Meanwhile, Mr. Morrison's case proceeded through the justice system. He was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to a long prison term. The news brought a sense of justice to many, but it also left a bitter taste for those who had considered him a father figure. Clara and other circus performers, with the support of Peter and Margaret, managed to find new opportunities and start their lives anew. The circus, once a symbol of enchantment and mystery, became a distant memory of a painful chapter. Peter and Margaret, now closer than ever, continued to support each other. In a moment of reflection, Peter confessed to his mother, "Sometimes, I still feel like I'm living in a dream, but then I remember you're here, and everything feels more real." Margaret smiled, her eyes full of love and pride. "And I'm here, for whatever you need. We'll create new memories together, and that's what matters," she said, holding her son's hand. The story of Peter and Margaret, marked by pain and suffering, became a story of hope and resilience. Overcoming the traumas of the past and building a new future together symbolized the power of love and forgiveness. As they walked together through the mansion's garden, under the soft light of the setting sun, Margaret whispered, "We're finally at peace." Peter, looking at the horizon, felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. "Yes, Mom, we finally are." And so, mother and son began to write a new chapter of their lives, where the scars of the past no longer defined who they were, but rather the love and hope they shared for the future.